Welcome, my friends, to this edition of the History of Christianity. Today we are on part 21. We're going to talk about two of the early church fathers, very influential leaders in the early church, Ambrose of Milan and John Chrysostom. You'll see in just a moment that these two guys were from different parts of the empire. Ambrose was from the western part of the empire, and John was from the eastern part of the empire. And by the time we're done with this session, you'll understand why that's important to make that distinction. We begin by talking about Ambrose of Milan. Ambrose had an unexpected election to his office of bishop. The reason for this is in AD 373, the office of the Bishop of Milan became vacant due to the death of the bishop. Ambrose was the governor of the city of Milan. He understood that the peace of the city was threatened because the Arians and the Orthodox Christians were at war, and both wanted to make sure that their guy would be the next bishop. Ambrose, as the governor, decided he needed to attend the election. He wanted to make sure things stayed at peace, that there wasn't a riot that broke out, that there wasn't a conflict, which could easily happen. It did in other places. And he decided, you know what, I'm going to be there and make sure that something like that doesn't happen. Well, tensions did begin to mount in the church, and so Ambrose decided as governor he needed to take up a role in getting everything to kind of calm down. So he addressed the crowd. He was a very good orator and was known for that even as the governor, and he was able to restore calm. Well, in the midst of that calm, suddenly a child cried out, "Ambrose Bishop." And he said it a couple of times, and all of a sudden the crowd started taking up the same cry. It's kind of like if you're at a ball game and the wave starts. You'll see where it's starting, 2 or 3 people try to start it, and they won't be too successful the first couple of times, but all of a sudden somebody else will take it up, and eventually it's going around the whole stadium. Well, this happened with Ambrose. The child started the cry, but the crowd took up the cry, and everybody in that place started crying out and echoing the call for Ambrose to be the bishop. Well, Ambrose had political aspirations. He was the governor of Milan, but he really wanted to move up in the political world. So he did not have any interest in becoming the bishop. He certainly did not go to that meeting to become bishop, and at the time, if you had told him that was what was going to happen, I'm sure he would not have attended. He tried to tell the people, I'm not interested, but that failed. So he actually tried to escape the city. They were so insistent that he was going to take this up that he tried to get out of there. But unfortunately for him, the emperor found out about it. And the emperor decided, you know what, it would be a great idea for this guy that was in the political world to now take this office of bishop. And so Ambrose had no choice but to agree. When the emperor tells you you need to do it, you need to do it. This is just another example of throughout this time, those lines that need to be very distinct between church and state really blurred. The emperor thought it would be a really good political move to have somebody that was kind of an insider in the political world to be in the church, to be in an important position in the church. It didn't really end up working out for him the way that he probably thought it would, but that was his thinking on it, and Ambrose agreed, and he became the Bishop of Milan. Although he was chosen for this office, Ambrose had actually never been baptized. He was a Christian, but he'd not gone through the process. Remember that there was a lengthy process for getting into the church. It was expedited for people of power. So that 3-year time frame that it took most Christians to actually become baptized, that got taken down to 8 days for Ambrose. So 3 years to 8 days, that's a pretty drastic change. And in that 8-day period, Ambrose was baptized, and they put him through the ranks, the various levels of ministerial order, so that he could take on this position. And so he did. After that 8 days was over, on December 1st, 373 AD, Ambrose was consecrated Bishop of Milan. Well, even though Ambrose didn't want to take this role on, that wasn't his idea, he did take it seriously. He decided, okay, this is my fate, this is what I'm going to do, so I'm going to do it to the best of my ability. He had a brother that was also in politics. He was a governor in another city, and his brother, Uranius Satirius, came in to help him fulfill his administrative duties, to help him with doing the administrative part of his job. So he got him to help him out, and he knew he was good at that kind of thing. He also began studying theology. Remember, this guy, he came as just being a marginal part of the church. He wasn't even a full member. And he knew that if he was going to serve as the bishop, he needed to know what he was talking about. He needed to understand theology. So he went from having almost no knowledge of theology to becoming one of the top theologians in the Western church. Pretty amazing that he was able to accomplish that, and just shows you the skills that God had put in his life that he didn't even know he had, that prepared him for ministry. And I'll make that segue to say to all of you listening, God's done that in your life too. If you're a part of his family, he's given you skills and abilities to use in his service. Sometimes it's in areas that we don't even think we'd be good at. If he's called you to do it, he's gifted you to do it. And that's what happened with Ambrose. Ambrose took up the cause of the poor. This is very, very important. He came into the church and realized the poor were really not being taken care of the way that they should have been. And he actually had a sermon that he gave the people as a result of an event that happened. A band of Goths had crossed the border, and they had actually had imperial permission to do it, but they then rebelled. And a bunch of people came flocking into Milan for refuge when these Goths came in. They let the people know there in Milan that some of them had been kidnapped and the Goths were demanding ransom. So Ambrose found out about this, and his response was that he ordered funds to be raised for the refugees and for ransoming the captives by melting off some of the golden vessels and other ornaments the church possessed. Well, this created a storm of criticism. People didn't like it, and Ambrose was not Arian. He was Orthodox. So the Arians were looking for anything they could find to criticize him. They were eager to find fault in him, and they accused him of sacrilege for having done this. And so he made this statement. He preached this sermon. He made this statement that I want to read to you now. So this is what Ambrose said in response to those who criticized him for melting down gold to pay for the ransom of these people. I'm quoting now. "It is better to preserve for the Lord souls rather than gold. He who sent the apostles without gold also gathered the churches without gold. The church has gold, not to store it, but to give it up, to use it for those who are in need. It is better to keep the living vessels than the golden ones." And that's the end of the quote. So Ambrose made this real push to the people that he had influence over to take care of the poor. And it's really a statement that we need to hear in our world today. As being Christians in the Western world, we kind of inherited the same types of things that they had. We have churches that are very well taken care of. They have very nice buildings. Many of them have large coffers of money. They have funds to take care of things. And there's certainly nothing wrong with being good stewards of money and even having reserve funds built in for times of emergency. But if all you ever do is just hoard money, then are you really fulfilling the call of God to take care of people in this world? Money that the church has needs to be given to missions. It needs to be used for the benefit of people. And a lot of churches, their mission budget is very small. I've been in churches where it's been very low. Those funds that are gathered that are set aside to take care of people, they need to really go to take care of people. They need to really be used in that way. And Ambrose took that cause up, and it's great that he did, but it didn't make him the most popular guy. He also admonished pastors to support the weak against the strong and to invite the poor to their feasts rather than the rich. So we've talked about this before, but as the church now has gone into the imperial age and the rich and the wealthy and the powerful have come into the church, it was very fashionable to court those types of people. We talked about why early on that was the case. It was in some ways a good thing for the church as far as becoming accepted by people largely in those classes that had not accepted them before. The elites tended to think that Christianity was just a poor man's religion and it was for ignorant people. And the church wanted to change that reputation. You can understand why. They wanted to be able to reach that group too. But in some ways they made some compromises that were not good. And one of the compromises that they made was that they really courted the elites. And Ambrose saw this as being an issue. And he admonished those other pastors that you don't need to be just courting the rich and inviting them. Reach out to the poor. They're the ones who really need to be at a feast. The rich are taken care of. It's the poor of the world. It's those that are in need that we need to reach out with the love of God and take care of their physical needs. So Ambrose he had a great cause and a great calling to help those less fortunate in society. Well, during this time, a young man came to hear Ambrose preach. And Ambrose was a very impressive speaker. And this young man was so impressed with what Ambrose had to say that he returned to his mother's faith. You're going to know this guy by name for sure. You may not know everything about him, but we're going to talk about him in a week or two, maybe next week or maybe the week after. But that is a guy named Augustine. He was actually eventually baptized by Ambrose. Ambrose didn't necessarily know what kind of a guy Augustine was going to end up being as far as his influence. But if you're not aware of who Augustine is in the pecking order of early church leaders, Augustine would one day become the most influential theologian for the West since the Apostle Paul. So this is a guy that's going to have a lot of influence, and he came into the faith and came to be a part of the church because of the ministry of Ambrose of Milan, a guy who didn't even want the job. God used him in that incredible way to reach this man. It just shows you what God can do in a person's life when they let him use them. Well, Ambrose wasn't without conflict when it came to the political world. The western portion of the empire was ruled by Gratian and his half-brother Valentinian. Gratian was killed, and the usurper, whose name was Maximus, threatened to take Valentinian's territory. Valentinian was a child, so he wasn't really able to rule. His mother, Justina, took care of things in his place, and she knew that Maximus was coming after him. So she sent Ambrose as an ambassador before Maximus to kind of plead their case of, hey, don't come after us. And Ambrose was successful. He got Maximus to back down and to call off the invasion. So you would have thought that Justina would have always considered Ambrose to be a hero for her. But the problem was Justina was Arian, so their relations were not good. Justina wanted a basilica for Arian worship to be celebrated. Ambrose considered Arianism to be heretical, which it is. So he refused. That was a strike against him in her eyes. It led to a long series of confrontations between the two. We don't really need to get into all of the things that happened, but what eventually happened was these confrontations ended when Valentinian was killed and Theodosius became emperor of the entire Roman Empire. We've talked about Theodosius before, and we're going to talk about him again today in light of his relationship with Ambrose. So Ambrose and Theodosius, they had a relationship that didn't start off all that great. Theodosius, if you may remember, was a Nicene Christian, so he was Orthodox. He would have been on the same theological side as Ambrose, but they still had clashes, and particularly on two occasions. The first clash involved some overzealous Christians who burned a synagogue in the town of Calanisium. Theodosius decided that the arsonists should be punished and that they must rebuild the synagogue. Now, that's a reasonable take. If you go burning somebody's church down, I don't care if they are a different religion, it's not really reasonable for you to just say, well, they shouldn't be punished for that, or they shouldn't have to make amends for it. Theodosius was in the right in this instance. Unfortunately, Ambrose didn't agree with him. He intervened, and the emperor backed down. And what happened was the arsonists didn't receive any punishment, and they didn't have to rebuild the synagogue. So in that case, Ambrose was in the wrong. But then there was another conflict, a second conflict, which involved a riot at Thessalonica. And during this riot, the commandant of the city had been killed by the rioters. Ambrose counseled the emperor to judge moderately. He knew that Theodosius had a really bad temper and would most likely want to really come hard after these people that did this. I mean, in some ways you can understand that. They killed a man. But Ambrose still thought that he needed to intervene, that he needed to make the emperor judge with a little bit of moderation. And he was successful, but later on, Theodosius started letting his anger get the best of him again. And he couldn't stand that these guys had done this. So he decided he was going to play a trick on them. He offered a pardon to the rioters, full pardon, and they were very happy about this. So they gathered together to have a celebration, to celebrate the pardon, and he knew that was going to happen. So Theodosius was waiting on him with some of his soldiers, and as soon as they got together all in one place to have a party about this, he had them killed. That didn't sit well with Ambrose, and Ambrose demanded that Theodosius repent. He actually stood at the door, Ambrose did, he stood at the door of the church when the emperor tried to come in, and he barred him from entering. I mean, this guy, he had some nerve, but remember, he did come from the world of politics, so he knew a little bit about that world. He stood there and said, no, you are not coming into this church until you show true signs of repentance. And Theodosius backed down. He agreed. He repented. He said he was wrong in what he did, and Ambrose won that. So these are the two major conflicts. One, Theodosius was in the right. Ambrose was really wrong, but Ambrose still won. And the second one, Ambrose was in the right, Theodosius was in the wrong, and Ambrose won that one too. If you're keeping score at home, it's Ambrose 2, Emperor Theodosius 0. That should tell you something about the influence of the church in the Western Empire. We're going to look at that again in light of what's going to happen in the Eastern Empire. But after this incident, relations between Theodosius and Ambrose became more cordial. Theodosius, I guess, figured out he wasn't going to win, so they decided they'd have to get along. Ambrose then died on April 4th, 397 AD on Easter Sunday. So very influential preacher at the time, very influential theologian, and a great example of the influence of the church in the western part of the empire. Remember, the western part of the empire is that's the old part of the empire, the Roman Empire. It's starting to crumble. It's not going to last much longer. And the church is going to continue to play a heavier and heavier role in not just ruling of the church, but actual political rule. So you're seeing two sides today. When we get to the other one, you probably already guess what's going to happen. But when we get to the eastern part of the empire, we'll see the exact flip side of the same coin. But you're seeing the need for the separation of church and state from both perspectives. The church doesn't need to be involved in the affairs of state. That's part of that. And that's what we're seeing here. The church is getting too involved in the politics. Of course, the other side of that is that the state doesn't need to be involved in the affairs of the church. They're supposed to be separate. So we're seeing now that the church is getting too involved in the state. They got too much power now. We're going to see the other side of the coin in just a moment. So let's move now to that other side of the coin when we talk about John Chrysostom. John was actually known in his lifetime as John of Constantinople. That was the name he went by during his life. This John Chrysostom was not anything that existed in his lifetime. In fact, it wasn't until 100 years after his death that he was given the name Chrysostom. And that name meant the golden-mouthed. So that wasn't his proper name. It wasn't his last name or something. That was a title that was given out of respect for him 100 years after his death because of his skills as a preacher and the way he was remembered. So he was known as John the Golden-Mouthed, but known as John of Constantinople in his day. And the title was well deserved because in a century of great preachers such as Ambrose we just talked about, Gregory of Nazianzus, John of Constantinople stood above them all. He was a preacher of preachers. He was the great of the greatest, and he was remembered as such. For John Chrysostom, the pulpit was the verbal expression of his entire life. It was his battlefield against the powers of evil. It was an unavoidable calling that led to eventual exile and then to his death. His preaching was very powerful, but it wasn't well received by some, and as a result of that, it led to his end, which we'll see in a moment. So how did he get his start? John began his career as a lawyer. He was trained in his native town of Antioch, but he eventually became a monk. John's mother's name was Anthusa. She was a dedicated Christian, and she was pleased when John, at age 20, began his 3-year training for baptism. So he made the decision to move on from his career as a lawyer to take up the cause of becoming a Christian. You can see why you'd have to make that decision, because you're taking 3 years to train. You can't be a lawyer and then do a 3-year extensive training as well. So he made that split, he made that move, and he began his training so he could be baptized and become a full official member of the church. John really wanted to join the monks. He wanted to be in the monastic life. But John's mother, as excited as she was about him coming to be a full-fledged Christian and going through all of the process to do that and being baptized, she was not thrilled about him leaving her. And she made him promise that he would stay around until she died, and he did. But then once she died, he joined the monks in the Syrian mountains and began a 6-year process of learning and practicing the monastic life. So some of the things we see about John and what his emphasis were and the conflicts he had, you can really look back on his background as being a monk. He never really left that mentality. And you can tell then from that emphasis why some of the problems rose up that did. So after that 6 years, he returned to Antioch, and he was immediately ordained a deacon, and not long after that a presbyter. And as a result of those roles that he got in the church, he began preaching. And he became famous right off the bat. He became very famous throughout the Greek-speaking church because of his ability to preach. And that led him to Constantinople. In AD 397, the emperor ordered that John be taken to Constantinople to fill the empty position of bishop. So, I mean, he moved right up to one of the most powerful positions in the eastern part of the empire, the bishop of Constantinople, as a result of his fame and recognition as being a great preacher. But then, again, we're seeing that flip side of the coin that we talked about. Now we've got the state interfering in the affairs of the church and deciding who the bishop should be. Just as big a problem as the church interfering on the other side with the state's business. This is a double-edged sword. John then, he's brought in by the powers that be in the government, and they can take him out too. So we're going to see that problem come up in a moment. But John's first task was to reform the life of the clergy. There were some serious problems going on with the clergy in Constantinople. Some among the clergy who claimed to be celibate had living in their homes what they called spiritual sisters. I haven't had a lot of time to really research this and understand what was going on, but I think we all know what was going on. This would provide an occasion for scandal for many. It's not a great idea for you to be a single man and have multiple quote-unquote spiritual sisters just living at your house. Even if nothing's happening, there's all kinds of speculation about what might be happening. That's a problem in and of itself. But let's be honest, the speculation's there because there's a great possibility something's happening that shouldn't be happening. So this was an issue, and John saw that as a real problem. Not only that, but other clergymen had become rich, living with as much luxury as the highest classes of the city. So here's this monk that lived out in the wilderness, the monastic life. He comes in, he starts seeing all these people, all these supposed ministers and clergy living as high as they could possibly live, and that didn't sit well with him at all. He didn't like it. The finances of the church were in shambles, and the care for the people was largely unattended. The very things that these ministers should have been taking care of the business of the church, and then making sure, more importantly than any of that, making sure that the people, the sheep that were in the flock that they tended, were being attended to, they weren't doing that. Well, John came right on in and he said, this is enough of this. He ordered the spiritual sisters out of the priest's homes, get them out. I don't care what the excuse is, they're not living there anymore. He put the church finances under a system of detailed scrutiny so that nobody could take advantage of the church finances. He even had the luxury items that were in the bishop's palace sold in order to feed the hungry. So he didn't just do it for everybody else, he did it for himself too. And he had the churches opened at times that were convenient not just for the wealthy, but also for those who had to work. So during the day when people were working, that's when the churches were open because the wealthy didn't have to have a job. The problem with that is they were doing that intentionally. The wealthy could have come anytime. It was because they knew the poor couldn't come at the time they were at work and they didn't want to associate with the poor. And the church took the side of the wealthy again. John didn't like that. He's the monk. He's the guy that wants to take care of the less fortunate. And he says to the churches, no, you're going to be opened at times that are convenient for both groups. They need to intermingle. They don't need to be kept separate. So he put a stop to that as well. John then also promoted his reform to the laity through his preaching. So I want to read another quote for you of what John had to say in his preaching. This got on some people's nerves. They didn't really like it. But he preached this from his pulpit to make sure that not just the clergy knew where he was coming from, but all of the people in the church. And these are the words he said, I'm quoting, "The gold bit on your horse, the gold circlet on the wrist of your slave, the gilding on your shoes means that you are robbing the orphan and starving the widow. When you have passed away, each passerby who looks upon your great mansion will say, how many tears did it take to build that mansion? How many orphans were stripped? How many widows wronged? How many laborers deprived of their honest wages? Even death itself will not deliver you from your accusers." That is a pretty much slap to the face of anybody that had any kind of wealth at all, much of anything. John's basically telling them, all that stuff you have, that could go to help people in need. And the way to look at it is, your mansion is being built on the tears of the orphans, on the sweat of those who are less fortunate, on the unclothed backs of those in society that don't have anything, all of this wealth that you have. It was a slap in the face to the people. And there were definitely people in that elite class that were not liking this guy one bit. But I ask you this, if old John came around today and preached in many of the churches around this country that same message, how well would he be received? I'm not thinking a whole lot. That's very convicting words for any of us. Even fellow ministers, you have to look at your own life and think, am I really fulfilling what God's called me to do? Do we have too much? And I know we all know that we do. But this man lived what he preached. He could have had all of this stuff. He could have had the very best of anybody, and he wasn't having it. And he put his life on the line, actually, to preach these words to people that did not want to hear them. And it cost him. It cost him to do it. But that's what God called him to do, and he's remembered to this day because of that. It's a very convicting message for all of us. I'm not laying this down on anybody. I'm not like John who can say, I lived a monastic life. I'm laying this down on myself as much as anyone. But we all need to really consider, are we living that same calling that John had? Diligent to take care of those that are less fortunate in our society, those around us. And we probably all need to consider that a little bit more. Well, this led John to conflict with a guy named Eutropius. Eutropius was the palace chamberlain to the emperor of the Eastern Empire, whose name was Arcadius. But Eutropius was actually the real power behind the throne, and he was the one who campaigned to have John made bishop. So because of that, Eutropius was expecting to be granted some special favors and concessions. Well, John wasn't having that. This was not a man that was going to be bribed by anybody or owned by anyone. Well, when Eutropius figured it out, he wanted him gone. And Eutropius was the guy that could get it done. But a storm broke when some people fled from the tyranny of Eutropius and took refuge in the church of St. Sophia. That was the big church there in Constantinople. They were being mistreated by Eutropius, and they got out of there, got away from him, and they came to the church for refuge. And John gave them refuge. He would not allow Eutropius' soldiers to enter the sanctuary, to come into the church. And he took his cause to the emperor, Arcadius, the emperor of the Eastern Empire. And unlike most of the times that he ever dealt with something when it had to do with Eutropius, Arcadius took John's side. That shows you again just how great of a speaker he was, and he was able to convince the emperor that Eutropius was in the wrong. So he took John's side, and after this, the power of Eutropius began to wane, and it waned so much that he lost all of his power, and the people were happy. They were happy because they had been mistreated by this guy, and they soon had some mobs that were out there looking for Eutropius to wreak some vengeance on him for what he had done to them. Well, Eutropius thought, where's the one place I can go where I can get sanctuary? And wouldn't you know it, he thought about the church. He thought about the Church of St. Sophia. He remembered that John, in defiance of all of the powers that be, would not allow somebody that sought refuge at the church to be taken. So he went, and sure enough, he was right. John defended him against the mob. He defended him against the army. And finally, and even the emperor himself, John said, no, you cannot come in and get this man. But Eutropius was stupid, and he started thinking, the church isn't going to really keep supporting me. So he fled the church, and he was killed by the mob, and that was the end of him. So what happened to John? Well, John Chrysostom's preaching made many more enemies among the powerful, not just this guy Eutropius. There was another one that came along that was really going to be his undoing, and this is Eudoxia. That's the emperor's wife. Now, you might be able to convince the emperor to go against the guy that's kind of been keeping him under his thumb and really been wielding the power, but you got another problem in store when you're dealing with the emperor's wife. She did not like John's popularity, and she did not like his preaching because it fitted her too well. She had even commented that she felt like as he was preaching, all the eyes of the people in the church were just looking at her, because she's one of the people that he's talking about, somebody who claims to be a Christian, but they're living in luxury while the poor are starving. So she's decided this guy's got to go. But first she decided maybe I can soften him up. So she came along, she made a really special grant to the church. She gave a lot of money. She's thinking, okay, he's saying we're not giving enough money to take care of people. Let me just give a bunch of money to the church. And her thinking on that was, well, once I make this grant, John's going to slack off on this. Nope, he didn't slack off. He kept on preaching. So that didn't work. So Eudoxia conspired with Theophilus of Alexandria, who was an Arian, so he didn't like John. They came up with a list of ridiculous charges while John was on a trip taking care of some business he needed to take care of. When he came back, he was made known about this list. There was a meeting to condemn him. He didn't even care. He didn't pay any attention to it. He went right on preaching and managing the church. Well, Arcadius, the emperor of the Eastern Empire, was brought in on this. After the little group that Eudoxia and Theophilus brought together to condemn John, after they did that, they came to Arcadius and said, you know, we've had these charges against John. He didn't even show up to defend himself. We found him guilty. He needs to be gone. So they asked the emperor to banish him. And the emperor's very weak, and so he did. He went along with it, and he banished John out of the city, or he ordered him to leave the city. Well, that didn't sit well with people. The bishops and other clergy from the neighboring towns gathered at the capital to oppose the order. They were not down with it at all. The people weren't either. But John refused their help. He wanted to keep peace. He knew that if he let them take up his cause, there was going to be conflict, and it was probably going to be armed conflict, and people would die. So he wasn't going to have that either. Again, the monk was coming out in him, that monastic life. He's not going to let somebody go to war for him. So he surrendered 3 days later. He surrendered to the authorities, and they took him into exile. But the people were not happy about this, and there was going to be a riot as a result of it. Eudoxia got scared. No, she wouldn't even be seen in the city. She stayed in the palace away from everybody because she was too afraid to go out. Theophilus the same way. They were out for blood, and they were out to get him too, so they stayed clear. And finally, Eudoxia went to her husband, Arcadius, and said, you got to get this guy back because people are going to kill me if you don't. So weak Arcadius is just doing whatever his wife tells him to do. Okay, you got it. So he gets John to return to the city. A few days later, he's not gone very long, and he takes up his position and goes right back to preaching. So happy ending to the story, right? Wrong. There's not a happy ending to the story because John's return did not solve the problem. He was not going to back down. He was going to keep preaching what he felt like was correct, and these people were going to keep on resenting it and resenting him for it. So he's back just a few months, and they come back to him again. Theophilus and Eudoxia go back to the emperor and say, all right, he's got to go. I don't even care. If the mob comes, they come. Get him out of here. So goes the same process. He's exiled. The people offer to riot and to stand up for him. John says no. He gets his things together. He surrenders to the authorities, and he goes out. Well, this time a riot, it did ensue. They weren't going to have it again. There was a riot. Several church leaders throughout the empire condemned the emperor and Theophilus of Alexandria. They lost all their reputation over this. People were not having it. And they were taking up the cause for John because they knew he was standing up for what was right. Well, finally, John was ordered into further exile. They said he's too close. He's not in the city, but he's a little bit too close. He was writing some things and sending them out. They said, let's get him out of here. So at this point, John was a pretty older guy. He wasn't in the best health, and he was ordered into exile on the shores of the Black Sea. So on the journey, the soldiers knew that John was not liked by the emperor. I mean, if you're sent into exile and even further exile, you're not going to be liked. And they knew he was in poor health, so they really made the trip hard on him. He wasn't very well taken care of. They made him go too far, too long. They didn't give him things he needed to help him, didn't give him any rest. And it just sapped all of his strength, and he got worse and worse sick. He finally became very seriously ill. And John was taken to a small church by the roadside at his request because he knew he was not going to live. He took communion there. He said a few words, his final words. He bid farewell to those around him, and he died. So that was the end of John over his stand for what was right. It's important because when we look at these two guys, we see something that I've already made mention of, but just to clarify it, The lives of Ambrose of Milan and John Chrysostom show us an indication of what would be the future course of the churches in the East compared to the West. Ambrose in the West faced the most powerful emperor of his time, and he won. On 2 occasions, he stood toe-to-toe with that emperor, and he won, both of them. Whereas John Chrysostom in the East faced a very weak emperor, and he lost. Now, you look at him and you think, okay, he could have won. Maybe, but the emperor was not backing down. Even when the riots came, he didn't back down. They just threw John further out. This shows you what is the future for the church in the West and the East. From this time forward, the Latin-speaking church of the West would increase in power over the state, while the Greek-speaking church of the East continued to be dominated by what would become the Byzantine Empire. So in history, you probably heard these words before, the Byzantine Empire. You've heard of Constantinople and the downfall of the Roman Empire. So that Western old Roman Empire, it's going away. It's not going to last much longer. It's become defeated, and the church gains more power as a result of that. But the Byzantine Empire of the East, it goes for another 1,000 years. So it's not going anywhere. And it's sure not going to be listening to the church leaders as to what to do. In fact, those leaders of the Eastern Empire, the Byzantine Empire, they want to interject their will on the church. The same coin we talked about. One side, there's too much influence in politics by the church. The other side, there's too much influence in the church by politics, by political people, the government. And both sides are not good. And it leads to problems that lead us again down this road that we're traveling to the doorstep of the Protestant Reformation. So it was good to get these two guys together. I actually combined 2 chapters today because even though we went a little long with this, there really wasn't enough material for doing these independently, but they mesh well together because of the fact that you see the difference in what's coming. So we've got 2 other guys left before we hit the Middle Ages portion of the study we're doing. And I don't know if we'll do them combined next week or not. I've got to look. I know the next chapter is a guy named Jerome. You may have heard of him. It's not a real long chapter, but then Augustine is pretty extensive. So we'll see. It could be that we separate them or they may go together. Well, I'm not sure yet. But regardless of that, we either have 1 week or 2 weeks until we hit the next big section of history of the church when we move now from this imperial church age to the Middle Ages period. And then we're going to get into all kinds of crazy stuff there. So you're going to want to stay tuned for that. And you're definitely not going to want to miss next week because Augustine, of course, is so influential. And many of the things that we've got as theology today came directly from him. So thank you once again for spending time with me today. It was a little bit longer session, but hope that you enjoyed it. Be blessed this week, and I hope to get to talk with you again next week. God bless.